The hum of the industrial refrigerators in the back of the store is usually a comforting, constant sound that fills the silence of my 12-hour shifts. But tonight, that same hum feels like a low-frequency warning vibrating through the very marrow of my bones. It is 2:15 in the morning, and the stretch of highway outside the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of this gas station is a void of liquid blackness, broken only by the flickering yellow glow of a single street lamp that looks like it is gasping for its last breath. I am completely alone in a building made of glass, a literal fishbowl in the middle of nowhere, where anyone could be watching me from the tree line without me ever knowing they were there until it was far too late. I was leaning against the counter, trying to focus on a crossword puzzle to keep my eyes from drifting toward the dark perimeter of the parking lot, when the landline phone behind the register let out a sharp, jagged ring that made me nearly jump out of my skin. We almost never get calls this late, and when we do, it is usually a trucker asking if we have diesel or a confused tourist looking for the interstate. So I cleared my throat and picked up the receiver with a practiced, tired greeting. There was no voice on the other end, only a heavy, rhythmic static that sounded like someone was dragging a brush over a metal screen, followed by a silence so profound it felt like the caller was standing right behind me, breathing into the nape of my neck. I asked if I could help them, my voice sounding thin and small in the empty store, but the only response was the distinct, metallic click of a lighter being flicked open and shut over and over again. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking as I wiped them on my apron, telling myself it was just a prank or a bad connection from a nearby tower. But then the phone rang again before I could even take a full breath. This time, I didn't say a word. I just held the plastic receiver to my ear and waited, listening to the silence of the store around me and the silence of the person on the other end of the line. "You should really stop touching your hair when you're nervous," a muffled, distorted voice finally whispered, the words sliding into my ear like a cold blade. "And you should definitely lock the back office door before you sit back down." My heart stopped, a cold wave of adrenaline slamming into my chest as I realized that this person wasn't just calling a random number. They were watching me through the glass walls right now, seeing every twitch of my fingers and every panicked glance I cast toward the shadows. I slowly lowered the phone, my eyes scanning the darkness outside, but the glare of the interior fluorescent lights against the windows turned the glass into a giant mirror, showing me only my own terrified reflection and the empty aisles behind me. I was trapped in a cage of light, unable to see into the darkness while whoever was out there had a perfect, unobstructed view of my every move, my every breath, and my growing desperation. I ducked behind the counter, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps as I reached for my cell phone, only to find that the screen was dark and refused to turn on, despite being fully charged only an hour ago. A sudden, sharp tapping sound echoed through the store, coming from the far left window near the automotive section. And when I looked up, I saw a small, muddy handprint smeared against the glass, right at eye level. The phone rang again, the sound now feeling like a physical assault. And when I answered it this time, the caller wasn't whispering anymore. They were laughing, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate with a sick, twisted anticipation. "The back door was already unlocked," the voice said. "Thank you for making this so easy for me. I hate having to break things when I want to come inside." I bolted toward the back of the store, my work boots thudding heavily on the linoleum as I raced toward the heavy steel door that led to the storage room and the small, cramped office where the security monitors were kept. I slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt, leaning my back against the cold metal as I stared at the bank of monitors, my eyes frantically searching the low-resolution black and white feeds for any sign of a human shape. The camera for the back loading dock showed nothing but a stack of empty crates, but the camera overlooking the front pumps showed a dark, hooded figure standing perfectly still, right where I had been standing just moments ago on the other side of the glass. They weren't moving toward the door, they were just standing there, holding a cell phone to their ear and looking directly into the camera lens as if they could see me through the screen. The office phone, a secondary line I forgot even existed, began to ring, and the sound in such a small, enclosed space was deafening, a shrieking reminder that there was nowhere in this building that was truly safe. I picked it up, my knuckles white as I gripped the handset, and I didn't even give them a chance to speak before I screamed that I had already called the police and they were only minutes away. There was a long, terrifying pause, and then the voice returned, colder and more calculated than before, telling me that the police wouldn't be able to get here because the only access road had been blocked by a fallen tree 10 minutes ago. I watched the storm knock it down. The voice lied, or perhaps it wasn't a lie, because I remembered the sudden gust of wind that had shaken the building earlier, a sound I had ignored but now realized was the sound of my only exit being cut off. I looked back at the monitor and realized the figure was gone. The space in front of the pumps was empty, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying than the ringing of the phone because it meant they were moving. I heard a soft, metallic scrape against the steel door I was leaning against, a sound like a fingernail or a key searching for a way in, and I realized with a jolt of horror that the office door didn't lead to safety. It led to a dead end. I looked around the tiny room, my eyes landing on the intercom system we used to make announcements to the people at the gas pumps, a system that was wired to the massive speakers mounted on the roof of the building. An idea began to form, a desperate, flickering hope born of pure survival instinct, and I reached for the intercom microphone, my fingers fumbling with the switches as I heard the office door handle begin to turn slowly, back and forth. I knew I couldn't fight them, but I could make enough noise to wake the entire county, even if the nearest house was 2 miles away. I turned the volume dial to its maximum setting, feeling the feedback whine in the speakers outside, and I began to speak into the mic, not in a scream, but in a calm, authoritative voice that I hoped would sound like a police dispatcher. All units, we have a silent alarm triggered at Station 42. Suspect is on site and armed. Proceed with extreme caution. Backup is 60 seconds out. I projected my voice, making it sound as mechanical and professional as possible while the door handle rattled more violently. I then grabbed a heavy metal hole puncher from the desk and slammed it against the filing cabinet, creating a loud, sharp bang that sounded remarkably like a gunshot when amplified through the massive outdoor speakers. The rattling at the door stopped instantly, the silence returning with a suddenness that was almost as jarring as the noise had been. I watched the monitors, my heart stopping as I saw the hooded figure sprint away from the building, disappearing into the dark woods behind the dumpsters, clearly spooked by the loud, public broadcast and the threat of approaching sirens. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there in the dark office, listening to the hum of the refrigerators and the sound of my own blood rushing through my ears. It wasn't until the sun began to peek over the horizon, turning the black sky into a pale, bruised purple, that I finally felt the courage to unlock the door and walk back out into the store. The landline was off the hook, dangling by its cord and swaying gently back and forth, a silent witness to a night that I would never be able to forget, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that glass-walled cage. I quit my job that morning, leaving my keys on the counter and walking out into the cool morning air, never once looking back at the trees where the silent caller had been waiting for me to step out of the light. The cold, damp air of the city at 2 in the morning has a way of seeping through the glass of a car window, making the leather seats feel like ice against my skin. My old sedan had groaned and shuddered before finally dying in the middle of a warehouse district where the streetlights are spaced so far apart that the darkness between them feels like a solid wall. I had already tried turning the key a dozen times, but the only response was a pathetic, hollow clicking sound that told me the battery was well and truly dead. I sat there for a moment, the silence of the cabin wrapping around me, before I reached for my phone to call a tow truck or a rideshare, anything to get me out of this industrial graveyard. I found a local towing company online and hit the call button, but the line didn't ring. Instead, it picked up instantly, as if someone had been hovering their finger over the answer button, waiting for my specific signal. There was no hello and no professional greeting, just the sound of a heavy coat ruffling against a microphone and the distant, wet slap of footsteps on pavement. I asked if this was the towing service, but the person on the other end remained silent, their breathing heavy and ragged, like someone who had just finished a long, exhausting run. I hung up, a cold shiver tracing a path down my spine, and tried to tell myself it was just a technical glitch or a wrong number saved in the business listing. Within seconds, my phone began to vibrate in my palm, the screen flashing with a blocked caller ID that seemed to glow with a predatory intensity in the dark car. I didn't want to answer it, but the isolation of the street was starting to get to me, and the thought that it might be the driver calling back to apologize was the only thread of hope I had. When I pressed the phone to my ear, the silence was back, but this time it was interrupted by a low, metallic scraping sound, like a ring being dragged across a corrugated metal fence. "Your battery is at 12%? A voice finally whispered, the tone devoid of any emotion. "And you have exactly 3 cigarettes left in the pack on your dashboard." My breath hitched in my throat as I looked down at my phone and then at the crumpled pack of cigarettes sitting right where the caller said they were. There was no way anyone could know those details unless they were standing close enough to peer through the tinted glass of my windshield. I whipped my head around, staring into the gloom of the surrounding warehouses, but I saw nothing but the rusted skeletons of old machinery and the flickering shadow of a loose tarp blowing in the wind. The caller didn't hang up. They just waited, letting the sound of their slow, rhythmic breathing fill the tiny space of my car, making the air feel thick and hard to swallow. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking with a fear that I could no longer hide, but the only answer was a soft, mocking chuckle that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. I tried to lock the doors, but the power locks were tied to the dead battery, and the manual pins felt stuck, jammed by years of rust and neglect. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated panic as I realized I was sitting in a metal box that was no longer a sanctuary, but a trap that let everyone see in while I was blinded by the night. Every shadow that moved in the corner of my eye became a person. Every creak of the cooling engine became a footstep, and the silence of the phone line became a countdown. The phone rang again, the vibration feeling like an electric shock against my leg, and this time I didn't even have to pick up for the voice to start speaking through the speakerphone. "I like the way you look when you're scared," the caller murmured, the sound of his voice now accompanied by the distinct crunch of gravel directly behind my rear bumper. "It's a shame your car chose such a quiet street to die on, because no one is going to hear you when I finally decide to break the glass." I looked in the rearview mirror, my eyes straining to see through the darkness, and for a split second, I saw the silhouette of a tall, thin man standing just feet away, holding a device that glowed with a faint blue light. I realized then that he wasn't just a random creep. He was using a signal jammer or some kind of localized tracker, which explained why my calls weren't going through to the real emergency services. He wanted me to feel isolated. He wanted me to believe that the phone was my only link to the world, while he used it to play with me like a cat with a cornered mouse. I knew that if I stayed in the car, I was waiting for the inevitable, but if I ran, I would be out in the open, vulnerable and easy to track in the maze of the warehouse district. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from the glove box, my fingers trembling so hard I almost dropped it, and I felt for the manual release of the door one last time. The caller spoke again, his voice dropping to a low, intimate growl that made my skin crawl with revulsion. "I'm reaching for the door handle now," he said, and as the words left the speaker, I heard the unmistakable clack of the exterior handle being pulled upward. I didn't wait for him to try again. I threw my weight against the driver's side door, catching him off guard as the heavy metal door swung outward and slammed into his chest. I didn't look back to see if he was down. I just bolted into the darkness, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I sprinted toward the only source of light I could see. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy and fast, no longer trying to be silent now that the game of psychological torture had turned into a physical hunt. I ducked behind a row of shipping containers, the smell of salt and old oil filling my lungs as I tried to keep my breathing shallow so he wouldn't hear me. I saw the blue glow of his device scanning the area, the light bouncing off the metal walls like a searchlight, and I realized he was tracking the signal of my phone. With a sudden burst of clarity, I realized that as long as I carried that phone, I was carrying a beacon that led him straight to my heart. I turned the phone off and shoved it deep into a gap between 2 heavy crates. Then I crawled on my hands and knees through the dirt, moving toward the far edge of the lot where the warehouses met the main road. I could hear him swearing in the distance, his voice echoing off the containers as he realized the signal had stopped moving, giving me the precious seconds I needed to reach the perimeter fence. I found a hole in the chain link, the jagged wire tearing at my jacket as I squeezed through, and I didn't stop running until I reached the center of the asphalt road. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the dark like a miracle, and I began to wave my arms frantically, screaming for help with every bit of strength left in my lungs. It was a local patrol car, the black and white paint job a sight so beautiful it nearly brought me to my knees in relief. As the officer stepped out, his flashlight scanning the tree line and the fence I had just escaped from, I looked back and saw a single, dark figure standing at the edge of the shadows, watching us. The man didn't move, he didn't run. He just stood there for a long moment before fading back into the darkness of the warehouses, leaving me shivering in the warmth of the police car's heater. I never found my phone, and I never went back for that car, because some things are better left lost in the silence of the night. The rhythmic humming of the central air conditioning system is the only thing keeping me company in this cavernous office space, where the rows of empty cubicles look like a graveyard of abandoned ambitions under the dim glow of the emergency lights. It is nearly 3 in the morning, and the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 64th floor offer a breathtaking, yet lonely view of the city skyline, which looks more like a circuit board of flickering lights than a place where millions of people are sleeping. I had volunteered to stay late to finish the quarterly merger report, thinking the silence would help me focus, but as the hours crawled by, the silence began to feel less like a tool and more like a predator, waiting for me to make a sound. I was deep into a spreadsheet, my eyes burning from the blue light of the monitor, when the desk phone 3 cubicles over began to ring, the sharp, electronic trill cutting through the air like a physical blow. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, because there was no reason for a landline to be ringing in a deserted accounting firm at this hour, especially not a line belonging to a colleague who had been on vacation for a week. I ignored it, letting the sound echo against the glass walls until it finally stopped. But as soon as the silence returned, the phone at the desk directly behind mine started its own insistent, rhythmic screaming. I turned around slowly, my heart thudding against my ribs, and I could see the small red light of the message indicator blinking in the dark like a predatory eye watching me from the shadows. I stood up, my chair creaking loudly in the stillness, and I walked over to the desk, compelled by a nervous energy that I couldn't quite suppress. I picked up the receiver, but I didn't say a word. I just held it to my ear and listened to the hollow, mechanical hiss of the line, a sound that felt like it was coming from a vast, empty distance. Then, the silence on the other end was broken by a soft, wet sound, the unmistakable noise of someone licking their lips before they began to breathe, a slow, deliberate intake of air that sounded far too close for comfort. "The coffee in the break room is getting cold, Elias," a voice whispered, a voice that was low and raspy, like sandpaper rubbing against dry wood. My blood turned to ice because my name isn't listed on the company directory for this floor, and I hadn't told anyone I was staying late tonight, not even the security guard at the front desk. I dropped the receiver back onto its cradle and backed away, my eyes darting toward the break room door at the far end of the hallway, which was cracked open just enough to let a sliver of fluorescent light spill onto the carpet. I knew I had to leave. I knew I needed to get to the elevators, but the thought of walking past that darkened hallway made my legs feel like they were made of lead. The phone on my own desk began to ring now, the sound more aggressive than the others, and I realized with a jolt of terror that the caller was moving through the office, calling the phones in a sequence that was leading them directly to where I was standing. I didn't answer it. Instead, I grabbed my bag and began to move toward the main elevator bank, my footsteps muffled by the thick office carpeting as I tried to stay low, hidden by the partitions of the cubicles. I reached the elevators and frantically pressed the down button, watching the digital display as the numbers slowly climbed from the lobby, each second feeling like an eternity while the phones behind me continued to ring in a haunting, synchronized chorus. A sudden, loud thump echoed from the ceiling tiles above the break room, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging itself through the ventilation shafts, a metallic scraping that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. The elevator finally arrived with a cheerful ding that felt mockingly loud in the oppressive silence. But as the doors slid open, I saw that the interior light of the cab was flickering, casting long, jerky shadows across the brass walls. I stepped inside and hammered the button for the lobby, but the doors didn't close. They hit an obstruction and slid back open, revealing a single, mud-caked boot wedged in the track. I scrambled to the back of the elevator, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I stared at the boot, waiting for a hand or a face to appear. But there was nothing, just the empty hallway and the sound of a dozen phones ringing at once. I realized then that the caller wasn't just trying to scare me. They were orchestrating a trap, using the technology of the building to keep me pinned in place while they closed the distance from the shadows. I lunged forward and kicked the boot out of the way, slamming the close door button with all my strength, and for a moment, I thought I was safe as the elevator began its long, stomach-dropping descent. The elevator shuddered and came to a grinding halt between the 50th and 49th floors, the emergency lights kicking on with a dim, red glow that made the small space feel like a tomb. The speaker in the ceiling crackled to life, and the same raspy voice from the phone filled the cab, sounding distorted and metallic as it laughed at my desperation. "You shouldn't have tried to leave so early, Elias. We still have so much work to do on that report," the voice said, followed by the sound of a heavy metal panel being unscrewed from the roof of the elevator car. I looked up, seeing the screws rotating slowly from the other side, and I knew that in a matter of seconds, the intruder would be dropping into the cab with me. I looked at the control panel, my eyes landing on the small, red lever for the freight override, a feature used by movers to manually control the speed and stop points of the lift. I pulled the lever and jammed my shoulder against the emergency exit hatch on the side of the car, which led to the adjacent freight elevator shaft, a space I knew was used by the nighttime cleaning crews. I squeezed through the narrow opening just as the top panel of the elevator car gave way, falling into the cab with a deafening crash that echoed through the shaft. I found myself standing on a narrow metal catwalk, the air thick with the smell of grease and cold dust, and I began to climb the service ladder with a frantic, renewed energy. I could hear the intruders shouting below me, their voice echoing up the shaft as they realized I had escaped the trap. But I didn't look down. I only looked up toward the maintenance floor where the service exits were located. I reached the landing and burst through the heavy steel door, finding myself in a stairwell that smelled of concrete and stale air. And I didn't stop running until I reached the ground floor and burst through the emergency exit into the cool, night air. I ran toward the street, my lungs burning and my legs shaking, and I didn't stop until I found a late-night diner filled with people and bright, unforgiving lights. I sat there for hours, clutching a cup of coffee that I couldn't drink, watching the entrance as the sun began to rise over the city, turning the glass towers into pillars of gold. I never went back to that office to collect my things, and I changed my phone number that very morning, because I knew that as long as I was reachable, the silent caller would never truly be finished with our deadline. I eventually found a new job in a small, one-story building where the only phones are the ones we carry in our pockets. And even now, I never stay past sunset, because I know that some silences are never truly empty.